Welcome to our discussion channel, where we delve deep into contentious historical texts. Today, we're exploring a radical take on that iconic passage in 2 Corinthians 12. It's, quite a journey. Imagine a text traditionally seen as Paul's ultimate personal confession, now being reinterpreted as a later Marcionite creation.
Wow, that's a bold claim, right? You mean to say that what millions hold dear might actually be a post-war, post-Jerusalem collapse reframe?
Exactly. It's like, turning a revered testimony inside out. The idea is that the version we have was actually shaped, or even forged, by a Marcionite school nearly a century after Paul's time. That meaning, it's potentially a redaction rooted in the tumult of post-Bar Kokhba times.
That's pretty intense. So, instead of being a direct outpouring from Paul himself, we might be hearing the voice of a community trying to reframe their suffering into a more politically charged narrative.
Right. They argue that in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt, when Jerusalem was, demolished and Jewish Christianity was collapsing, there was a need to reshape Paul into someone who championed a God of grace over a wrathful, law-bound creator.
Yep.
Essentially, they transformed his writings into a manifesto of escape from the Jewish past into a new Gentile future.
So what's really at stake here? Are we saying this is just academic conjecture, or is there some solid evidence behind it?
Well, scholars like Markus Vinzent and Matthias Klinghardt note that we don't actually have any manuscripts of 2 Corinthians before the Marcionite canon, which, get this, is dated to around 140 CE.
Yeah.
This absence of earlier texts kind of fuels the theory that the text we revere was pieced together later and molded for ideological purposes.
That sounds almost like we're looking at a tool of propaganda. But, isn't it a bit extreme to dismiss Paul's original voice entirely?
I hear you, but check this out. Critics like Hans Dietrich Betz and Margaret Thrall view 2 Corinthians as, a patchwork document, a Frankenstein's monster stitched together from several fragments.
Right.
This suggests significant editorial intervention over the decades, possibly to align with the emerging Marcionite theology.
So you're saying the text was already in flux when these redactors, maybe even Marcion's own circle, came in and reworked it completely?
Yeah. It's like, imagine taking a diary and splicing in new chapters that, completely change its tone and message. The original might have been about personal struggle, but the re-edited version becomes a statement about divine mercy and the rejection of an old punitive God.
I get that. And with the context of 135 CE, where Jerusalem, renamed Aelia Capitolina, symbolized the crushing of Jewish nationalism, the narrative takes on a new political resonance.
Exactly. The text then functions not just as a reflection of personal agony, but as a political manifesto. It reinterprets suffering as a sort of divine proof that God has abandoned the flesh-bound laws of Israel in favor of the spiritual aspirations of the Gentiles. In this light, Paul's thorn in the flesh is recast as a symbol not of personal infirmity, but of the evil inherent in the material world.
That's a fascinating twist. But doesn't that seem to contradict the traditional understanding of Paul's theology?
Yeah. And that's where the debate heats up. Elaine Pagels, for example, points out that in Marcionite thought, the revealed Father of Christ is entirely separate from the creator of the old world, a concept perfectly mirrored in 2 Corinthians 12.
Yeah.
So, the emphasis on grace over judgment aligns more with 2nd century Marcionite ideas than with a 1st century pained apostle.
Interesting. So this text could actually be seen as a proto-apocalypse of Paul, blending his persona with a theology of weak or even submissive grace, aimed at contesting the prevailing Jewish law.
Right. It's basically a rebranded version of Paul as the champion of merciful grace, a kind of, visionary who has seen the heavenly realms and, now operates as a model for a gentle, even submissive kind of power. This reimagining ties into the broader Marcionite effort to carve out a new narrative for Christianity after the tumult of war.
And let me get this straight. By editing these texts, Marcion's circle was, in essence, teaching a political lesson to their community, a sort of, we're not bound by the harshness of the Old Covenant manifesto.
That's exactly it. Marcionites saw Paul's writings as a way to validate their belief in a God who embodies mercy rather than punitive judgment. They deliberately omitted or reinterpreted any elements that tied him to Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
It's like they had the narrative scissors and chose to cut out any connection to the older, harsher covenant.
But don't you find it a bit problematic, though? I mean, if we start thinking that the foundational texts were essentially political tools, what does that mean for our understanding of early Christianity?
I mean, it definitely challenges long-held beliefs. It suggests that what we've come to regard as a deeply personal and divine account might actually be a later construction designed to serve a specific agenda.
Yep.
And this recontextualization blurs the line between genuine theological insight and, well, manufactured doctrine.
So, if Paul's thorn was reinterpreted as a symbol of the material world's curse, then his visionary experience of the third heaven becomes a, dare I say, crafted mysticism rather than raw, personal ecstasy.
Yeah, it's like saying, look, here's not just the struggle of one man, but the struggle of an entire community caught between two worlds.
Right.
It's a narrative that transforms personal affliction into, societal commentary, a sort of emblem of the disintegration of old order in favor of a new, radiant, yet controlled form of grace.
That reimagining creates a kind of dichotomy. The wild, rebellious vision of an apostle is tamed into a neat, almost bureaucratic model of suffering and meekness that perfectly aligns with emerging church politics. Yes?
Exactly. It's as if Marcion's redactors wanted to domesticate that raw ecstasy into something more palatable and politically safe, a sort of, controlled spirituality.
Yeah.
Gerd Ludemann even described it as the domestication of ecstasy, where the intense visionary experience gets recast into a model for obedient, almost bureaucratically acceptable faith.
So all this means that Paul, as we traditionally know him, might be more of a literary facade than an actual historical figure's raw voice?
Well, at least in this context, it suggests that the voice we hear in 2 Corinthians 12 may have been, heavily filtered. It's not so much Paul directly speaking, but rather a text that's been overlaid with the political, theological, and existential concerns of a later era, a time when Gentile Christians were desperate to distance themselves from Jewish law.
That's both incredible and a bit unsettling. The idea that Christianity could have been reshaped by those who saw Paul's writings as a tool to legitimize a new order, one where, vulnerability and suffering become virtues, really shakes up the narrative.
Absolutely. And what's really wild is that by 180 CE, Orthodox voices like Irenaeus and Tertullian were already in motion trying to reclaim Paul. They accepted his letters, sure, but then they introduced corrections to align his writings with traditional doctrine. It's almost like they were performing damage control on a text that had already been altered.
I can see how that would create a sort of layered authenticity problem. How do we then discern the true voice of Paul, if any?
That's the million-dollar question. When texts have undergone so much redaction and ideological reshaping, it becomes, incredibly challenging to separate the initial spark from the later embellishments. Some even suggest that this might have been the seed of later apocryphal literature, like the Apocalypse of Paul, which, interestingly, shares a lot of that mystical vocabulary.
Yeah, and that mystical, almost sci-fi description of multiple heavens and secret revelations, that sounds a lot closer to 2nd century Apocrypha than to an authentic 1st century letter.
Right. It's like, the language and tone in these passages are more in sync with later developments. There's even a point made by researchers Richard Carrier and Robert Price that nothing in that chapter is intrinsically tied to the 1st century. It's all very suggestive of a later, more reflective, or even constructed theological narrative.
I appreciate the nuance here, but aren't we, in a way, undermining the experiences of early Christians by labeling these texts as mere political propaganda? I mean, Could there have been genuine spiritual experiences that got reframed later without completely losing their original essence?
That's a fair critique. There's definitely a continuum where personal belief and political ideology often
Yeah,
intersect. However, the argument here is not to dismiss early Christian spirituality entirely, but to acknowledge that the very texts we revere might have been repurposed to serve strategic communal needs in turbulent times.
right, I see. So it's less about outright fabrication and more about recontextualization, turning personal affliction into a collective symbol in a post-revolt society.
Exactly. It's a reinterpretation in the crucible of historical trauma. The transformation of Paul into a voice of gentleness and submission was likely a deliberate act by Marcion's followers to validate their break from the past.
Yep,
It's about turning pain into proof and surrender into a form of strength, a radical inversion of the expected narrative.
and by doing so, they essentially provided the emerging church with what might be its emotional and ideological centerpiece, even if questionable in origin.
Right. It's like borrowing from an iconic diary and, republishing it with edits that reflect the prevailing mood of the time. Rome's, need to impose order on chaos, and to present a version of Christianity that was cleanly separated from its Jewish past.
This really makes you wonder how much of what we hold sacred was influenced, or, dare I say, engineered, by the socio-political dynamics of later centuries.
Absolutely, it's both genius and, a little unsettling. It opens up the possibility that one of Christianity's most personal passages is actually a product of strategic reformulation rather than unedited divine inspiration.
Yeah. So maybe Paul's thorn isn't just about personal suffering at all. It's emblematic of a historical wound, a lasting trauma inflicted by the clash between an old world and a new empire.
Exactly, it becomes a kind of historical allegory. It's a wound not of flesh, but of history, a narrative scar that tells the story of faith and transformation. And that in itself is a profound rethinking of what those texts mean to millions today.
I suppose in the end, whether you see it as the genuine voice of Paul or a later ideological remix, it serves as a reminder that history and theology are deeply intertwined.
Right, and it just shows that even our most cherished texts can be reinterpreted through the lens of shifting contexts, politics, and the human need for meaning.
Yeah. Well, this conversation has truly opened up a new perspective on what many regard as timeless scripture. It's fascinating, intriguing, and admittedly a bit provocative.
Indeed, it's a reminder that behind every revered text there might be layers of history, interpretation, and even manipulation. And by peeling back these layers, we begin to see a fuller picture of our past.
Thanks for this thought-provoking journey. It's been both challenging and enlightening.
Absolutely. Thanks for tuning in and engaging with these complex ideas. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, sometimes the deepest truths hide behind the layers of history.